Buongiorno, everyone. I am Andrea. Buongiorno means good morning. And if I have any problem because I'm not a native speaker, I will use gesture. That is the universal language we have in Italy.
Yeah, I'll just use this. And I will say goedemorgen. I'm Quirine. Well, I'm Dutch, and this actually happened last week. So if you found my bike, please let me know. This is Amsterdam scene. Quick disclaimer?
Yes, quick disclaimer, just to start with a blue screen. Everything we say is actually our views. So, having done the legal part, let me just introduce who we are. We do not work actually for the Cortana team. That is a question that some of you asked today. We are in the consulting branch of Microsoft, and we are part of a global UX practice that now, interestingly enough, given that was mentioned before, is mixed with the mixed reality team that works on HoloLens. What we do is to make other codes. We work with our clients to actually find solution with them, and we partner with them. So, about today, we are not going to talk about trends, but we can point to that at a later stage. So just contact us in case these are our contact on Instagram. And if you want something more formal, yes, we are also on LinkedIn. But just to repeat, the clicker is not collaborating. Here we go. These are our contacts. So,
yes. I will take you along a bit on my design process. So whenever I get pulled into a customer meeting where we kick off a new digital agent, the first thing I really pitch and always remind myself of that there's a really big difference between communication. We type typically 40 words per minute, whilst speaking we can reach up to 150 words per minute. And for me, this is really important because this also really highlights the difference between creating a chatbot versus a voice agent. And often these two are mistaken as being the same, whilst the experience is very, very different. So yeah, just to remind you of this interesting fact as well. Then what usually happens is that voice interaction design is often perceived as something that is quite easy because often phrases and answers seem really simple, the match between them. And I usually actually explain that creating the happy path is the easy part. So listening in on an utterance and coming up with an answer to that, in a perfect world, it would work like this. But usually that's not what happens because we have to plan for what can go wrong. With that, I mean that when we don't pick up the words a user is saying, there might be some lag, there might be a weird accent in the mix. We just are missing parts of their utterances that we can match with our language models. So we really have to think in a more branched approach. Whenever you will, maybe you will design your first voice agent in a while, please remember that you need to think in all the complexity that comes when something goes wrong. Then what's also very important that, as Andrea and I are often asked to design voice agents for our customers, we are not talking about designing skills for Alexa or Google in that way. We are actually, or Cortana in that sense, we are actually creating a branded voice assistant, and creating a new agent is something very, very complex as well. Because we're not talking about just the design of the conversation, we're talking about the whole context of such an agent. And the questions on branding we usually kick off with, which I also just want to show to you because I feel these 4 pointers are are very, very important to set straight from the beginning. This impacts your overall process later on, but just it impacts the whole experience in the end as well. So you really need to start off with how does the virtual agent look like and how does it react? What's in the name? The name is a very interesting one. In voice agent world, let's call it, we have to think about names that are a bit quirky or a bit different than normal names we see around us, because they often work as trigger words, so you can trigger up an assistant with that word. Hence why the names as Siri, Alexa, or Cortana are a bit different. And in that sense, we also have to think about what gender we want to represent. So usually we see, what I see a lot is that people are thinking about genderless names. That then really relates to, how the assistant reacts. So really the tone of voice relates to setting that character and creating that branded name as well. Where in the end, because our customers are in a diverse domain, so it can be in retail versus automotive or all the way at the other end in manufacturing, we also have to think about how does the agent react when he or she can't answer the question, and how do we hand that off? So you can also think about customer service relations. How can we make that integration work? So to end off, these 4 pointers are very, very crucial to discuss in the beginning, and getting these right is very important.
So one important thing we are seeing is, especially working with such a variety of clients, is that voice is becoming part of their design system. I know that for especially the visual designers, this is like a freak out moment, but yes, it's not just having a UI library. What we mean by having a design system is a very much broader concept. For that, we have another deck and another presentation, but if you're interested, just grab us later.
Yes, just to add on, I just wanted to give you one example of a customer that I've worked closely with to get you thinking about the complexity that happens, not only in designing the conversation flows and the branching out, but just in the overall context of where this assistant will interact with the user. I just wanted to go for the car context, because we tend to think a lot about skills that we can trigger versus in your home, right, versus speakers, sorry. But that's not usually the case on the assistant work we get pulled into. We have to think about certain context limits. And for BMW, we worked on iPad, so that's their personal agent in the car that actually interacts with Alexa as well in the car. So that's also a very interesting thing we can discuss later, how agents interact with each other. But when you think about the car context, in current state, it's really about safety first, right? You're driving, and what happens if that voice interaction goes wrong and you're looking at your secondary view, so the head unit screen, and you crash into somebody else? That's a big thing, right? So we really have to think about what we show on these secondary views to actually help with the conversations. On the other hand, there are also secondary inputs. So in the car, you can trigger certain parts of your car via buttons even. And what happens if you're talking to your agent and you're doing other things that relate to the car setting again? So I just wanted to share this, that this is also only the view that you see as a driver, right? There are other people in the car. What happens when others start talking? How do we track who's saying what? And what happens if you step outside of the car and you still want to talk to your iPad assistant from BMW? So just to share some light on how complex this can get. Yeah.
So The interesting thing is that very often we are asked about, okay, what is the process for a lot of things? The process is always the same. I think that here in the room we all know what is the process. We start really understanding the user, and as Quirine was saying, it's about doing contextual research. In the case of conversational assistant, it's really about understanding what the user are doing in that precise moment. That changes everything dramatically. Of course, the scenario definition and clicker works. Okay, it worked. And iterate, and at the end is about iterating. Okay, this is, as I said, something we all know. But the thing that very often get forgotten is when we step out is to continue
I'll do it.
Thank you, doing data iteration. Conversation is something that changes over time. The way we use language today, the words we use today, will change in a couple of years' time. We need to be sure that language is actually growing with the assistant, and the assistant is able to understand what people are saying, because languages mutates very rapidly as well. So to explain you the complexity of this, I actually want to introduce you with a friend of mine. His name is Bobby. Now, who is Bobby? Bobby is a digital assistant that is for the public sector. In this case, Bobby will be rolled out very soon by Cardiff Council. So total different scenario from what Quirine was working on. And the idea is to basically have a seamless user experience that user will love, but there is just a tiny bit. Cardiff is the capital of Wales, and they are totally bilingual. And there is Welsh, and you step in and say, okay, I can absolutely treat I'm Italian, Welsh like Italian, kind of, because then you discover that there are 40 different dialects within the language. How do you handle such a complexity in a language? So we had to find, through research, what was the best way to handle such a complexity. In this case, we discovered that there was a particular formal Welsh that we could handle, and we decided to restrict the use of the conversational assistant to what is formal Welsh. So if someone is talking into a dialect that the bot is not understanding, the bot replies saying, hey, can you use some words that are a little bit too formal so that I can understand you? So the nice thing, and I'm gonna move the clicker there, no worries. So you have the audience, and then you have the interaction. So this is the first thing that you need to start understanding. The audience here was very important because you think, oh, okay, council, how does it work? Who is going to everybody? What about kids? Because the character is something very playful. So how do we handle kids? How do we handle things when they go wrong? And on the other side, we had a chatbot that actually can be used across different channels. So via voice when you call, or via the browser, or via an app that is actually living on your phone. So basically, between the chatbot and the audience, what is happening is that there is an interaction in the middle, the point of contact, that is across a lot of different touch points, as usual. But in this case, what you get is like, yeah, I want to request something, and I want to get an answer. It should be as simple as that, as we were saying at the beginning. But when you are in this scenario of request and answer, you actually can have requests in a lot of different ways. This can happen also in different ways depending on what is the endpoint you're using. The way I type something is different from the way I actually communicate via verbal voice. So we call these utterances. So the utterances are the different ways you can actually ask for the same thing. Can I have the water? Give me the water. I need a bottle of water. I just run out of water. I'm always asking the same thing. So I need to match the utterances, not really with an answer, but actually the bot needs to be able to understand what is the intent of the user, which it's different. The moment I ask something like, okay, I run out of water, I may actually trigger something that is different from I need water right now because I'm thirsty. So think about, especially, I'm just giving you a practical example. You have a problem with your water supply in your house, your pipe broke, I don't have water, that can mean two different things. So how do you map occurrences? This is where you need to rely with your teams. You need to partner with the people that actually speak with your audience. So you basically lock everybody in a room and you cover it in Post-it. You have customer care people, you have comms people, you have the product owner and the developers. That's the other important thing. Everybody should contribute together. Multidisciplinarity when you create something is important. When you're talking about language, it's at a different level. It really goes a couple of level ups. So how do you start doing something so complex? You start basically trying to understand what are the most common tasks people ask. In this case, we discovered that the majority of the time people ask about waste. So, like, when do you collect my waste and how do I report fly tipping? Then, of course, the classic QA things. And for each scenario, you actually need to go into the details of each step that the user will have to do. And before you actually develop even writing one line of code, it's really important that you go out and you say, okay, this is my conversation, and you go and test it for the different touch points you're going to use. In this case, this sketch is for the app, but actually you need to ask a question also about the other things, because the way people interact with voice is absolutely different from the app. And what about when they want to end off from one touch point to the other? So you need to really understand how you can create a seamless experience.
Maybe just to add on to that with voice, what's also really interesting with testing, it really works if you turn yourself around and you let the assistant talk to you, so you're not tempted by looking at any screen. So you're only really listening to the conversation, because in those conversations, it can get quite complex in your first designs. You realize you're asking multiple questions at the same time, for example, and you really need to stick to just asking one question. And hearing that role play back without looking at anything is really, really important when you think about voice.
So,
yeah.
Key learnings.
Just to round off, what we would really like you to take away from this is whenever you have the chance to create a voice agent for a brand or for your own company, you really need to start small. What we actually mean with this is that, especially now in these current days, we realize that voice is very important and there's a future in that, but companies or in their strategy, people often think really big, right? But starting with the key skill, so what is your company actually really, really good at? What is the main question people would ask your brand to do for them? Start with that. And then you can go and build up all the other layers around or all the other skills you want to expand it with. But just really start with that small skill, because your internal team also really needs to learn this process. So your devs need to know how to code for this, and your designers need to know how to design for these conversations. And the learnings you get from that small kickoff skill, let's call it, are so worth it in the later run. Yeah.
The second thing, the second takeaway is really about be sure that you adapt this conversation flow depending on what you're using. And as I was saying before, understanding how your audience is going to use these across the different touch points. Think about a mom that actually is holding a baby and cannot at the moment talk via the phone, but the baby now is sleeping, so I'll actually switch to the keyboard because I don't want to talk. So think about the context your audience wants to work on.
Yes, and then localization. I've repeated it 3 times because this is also very, very crucial. So from the beginning, whenever you start with this agent, think about what region are we talking about, what country, what languages. I've experienced quite some interesting things with, for example, the car maker, which I can explain now openly, that there's a very big difference between the way you guys in the UK talk about car parts versus in the US. And even that understanding, that differentiation in natural language when people refer to cars or car parts is already very complex, and it's only one language I'm talking about in that sense. And of course you have English in many other forms as well. Another thing about localization that also really impacts your voice agent is when you think about the bigger sense in regions. So for example, in Asia, users are very attached to hearing a more friendly assistant, and usually those assistants also have a higher pitched voice. So I'm taking it quite far now that even voice fonts differentiate within these regions. So whenever you start something like that, first draw out the whole world, think about the regions, then the countries, then map out all the languages that fit in these regions, and then in the end you need to localize it to that very core, because otherwise people won't use it. If they won't start talking naturally with the assistant, sorry to say, but why are you even making it then? So it's very, very important.
And the importance is also in being able to understand these and understand if what we are doing is the right thing for the audience you're working with. So having a solid plan that means having really a structured way to do research that is not just casual, and to tie back with what we were saying before with the Scrum methodology is not that you arrive at the end of the sprint and you're like, okay, now let's do a little bit of guerrilla testing. No, it's really about having a methodology behind it, because otherwise things can go absolutely wrong. We saw the example of the car, so think about the responsibility as designers you have when you are designing something like that. And we actually want to leave you with a question, two open questions actually, about the future. So,
yes, the first one I really want to ask you guys is if the world will be dominated by only the major agents we know. So how do we see that coming forward these next years? We've seen a lot of requests by brands asking for their own virtual agents and controlling, in that sense, their own data, learning from their conversations because they own that part. How do you guys think this will evolve in the future?
And very connected to this and connected to what I was introduced with, the love of data. What about the privacy? How do we ensure that the users are still owning their data? Especially when everything is through conversations. This may actually become something even bigger to manage. And I think these two are things that we need to keep in the back of our mind as designer. That was it. And at this point, we have the last line.
Questions. Ask questions. So we've got two questions, and we will need to keep them kind of relatively brief. But the two questions, the first one was, you mentioned that there's a trend towards using genderless names. And so somebody was interested in whether that's because there's a user reaction when there's a gender kind of associated with a bot.
Yes.
The simple answer.
There's a lot of research in the space that's out there, because why are we having, firstly, as a female, I also feel this, why are these virtual agents often female, right? And there's a lot of psychology behind it, because if we want to make it very black and white, females are more caring and more empathetic in that sense, which often relates to also having a higher pitched voice, which doesn't sound as strict as a male voice, which I'm totally extrapolating it now. But there's also a question that I often ask back: why are we always pitching for these female agents? And there's a really interesting project, which is, well, the assistant is coincidentally called Q, which has nothing to do with me, but that's my name. But it's a genderless voice agent, so you can search it online and try it out and hear how they try to blend in a male and female voice in making that sound like an actual person as well, which I think is super fascinating. But there's a lot going on in this certain area. Yeah.
Actually, if I may add, you can see Q, I think, at the Design Museum at the moment. Is exposed, and I had the pleasure of interacting with it. It's very fun experience.
Yeah.
And our next question, what are, you obviously talked about branding the kind of chatbot itself, but what are the branding elements of a client that you're having to consider when creating that personality?
That's okay.
You can just give a couple.
We can stay here. So just to do a parallelism, when you interact with the brand, okay, think about the TV ads. To stay in the automotive, a lot of automotive at the end have a sound that connects them to the brand. So sound is already part of the brand. The way a car sounds when you're driving it is something that is part of it. Think about the PlayStation, think about the Mac when it turns on. So that is something that is always connected to a brand. Now we are, I think, bringing this to a next level. And this is where the conversational assistant are really taking the branding to a next level. So I think we have a lot of responsibility. As UXer, I think we need to also go back to the people that have done branding for a lot of time, and the people that have done branding a lot of time needs to come to us. So there is a cross-contamination we need to make happen in our industry to make it very tailored to our brand.
And just to add on, this I pitched it really quickly, but this is really hard. This takes, I've seen research take many years for particular companies I interact with, where they take this very seriously as well, right? So a trick we usually use is drawing out lines and then putting contradicting things on both ends, and then using it as a skill to figure out, oh, are you really funny or just very strict? So you're maybe not the best example, but aligning those sliders really helps. But this is a whole side project, let's call it. So whenever
next year, maybe.
No, but just to set that expectation straight, it's really important to start with the brand. So having that basis, and then from that point onwards, start creating your agent instead of the other way around, or doing it at the same time. You need to do it before.
Brilliant.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much. I hugely enjoyed that. So let's have a huge round of applause for Quirine and Andrea.
Thank you.
Do you want to take your...
Okay.
All right.